He stood in the doorway with his bag slung over his shoulder, casual as ever, like he was heading off to a poker night or some late business call. "I'll be at a friend's house tonight," he said, not even looking me in the eyes when he zipped up his jacket. A friend. That word hung in the air, and if I hadn't already known what it meant, I might have laughed at the irony. He thought it was clever, vague enough to slip past suspicion, safe enough to avoid detail. But it wasn't clever. It was sloppy. And sloppiness is what ruins men like him. I didn't ask which friend. I didn't ask what time he'd be back. I just smiled the way a good wife is supposed to smile, like I believed him. Like I hadn't already been inside that house once before, standing in her bedroom, staring at the perfume bottle she thought she hid in the drawer. He kissed me on the cheek. Perfume lingered on his skin. Not mine, not ours. Sweet, powdery, cheap. She wore it too thick, as if drowning herself in it would hide what she really was. He didn't notice my jaw tighten. He never noticed. The front door closed, and I stayed there for a long moment, listening to the echo of his footsteps fading into the night. My heart wasn't pounding. My chest wasn't tight. That part, the shock, the ache, the helplessness, had burned itself out weeks ago when I first confirmed what he was doing. What replaced it was sharper, calmer, like holding a blade in my hand and knowing exactly where to cut. I walked to the window and watched him back out of the driveway, his taillights disappearing into the quiet Dallas street. The neighborhood was still, porch lights glowing, sprinklers clicking in the distance. Everyone tucked into their perfect suburban lives, while I was standing in the dark, already planning how to end mine with him. But tonight wasn't about the plan. Tonight was about the reveal. I pulled the small duffel I'd stashed earlier from the hall closet. Inside, gloves, flashlight, phone charger, a set of keys that weren't supposed to exist. He thought he was careful, hiding the spare in his desk drawer under a stack of tax papers. Careful men check twice. Arrogant men assume nobody's looking. Her house was across town. A modest place, beige siding, trimmed hedges, the kind of place that screams normal. That was what he wanted, I realized. The illusion of normal while he built a second life in the shadows. He didn't know I'd been there before. He didn't know I'd timed the drive, memorized the locks, tested the silence of her street at night. As I drove, the city stretched out around me, glass towers in the distance fading into strip malls and sleeping cul-de-sacs. My hands were steady on the wheel. The radio stayed off. My thoughts stayed sharp. Every second ticking down was another second closer to him walking into the one place he thought he was safe. The house sat at the end of a quiet street, one porch light glowing faintly on the corner. I parked 2 blocks away and walked, the night air heavy with the smell of cut grass and asphalt still cooling from the day's heat. The world was too calm for what I was about to do. Her curtains were drawn, but I already knew the layout. Living room to the left, kitchen straight back, bedroom down the hall. I slipped the key into the lock, and the soft click of the bolt sliding open felt like an invitation. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. The inside smelled faintly of vanilla candles and cheap wine, a jacket tossed over the back of the couch, heels abandoned near the door. She lived carelessly, like someone who thought her secrets were safe. I moved through the room slowly, memorizing every detail. The way she left her phone charging on the counter, the half-folded laundry spilling out of a basket, the framed photo of her smiling in a place my husband had taken me once before. I chose my spot in the bedroom. Not hiding, not crouching, standing tall in the center of the room where the shadows didn't reach. He would open the door, see me first, and everything he thought he controlled would collapse in that one instant. The weight was silence carved into minutes. I stood there, breathing evenly, every sound amplified. A dog barking 2 streets over, a car door slamming in the distance, the faint hum of her refrigerator. My phone vibrated once in my pocket. A message from him. "Don't wait up." I almost smiled. Headlights swept across the blinds and I froze, though not with fear, with anticipation. The engine shut off, A car door clicked. Two voices, hushed but playful, floated toward the house. His and hers. She laughed, and it cut through me like glass. Not because it hurt, but because it confirmed how perfect the stage was. Keys jingled. The front door opened. Shoes scuffed against the floor. They spoke in low tones, words too soft to catch, but I could imagine them. Careless, confident, dripping with the kind of secrecy they thought nobody else would ever hear. The floorboards creaked closer. Her perfume reached me first, that heavy, suffocating sweetness that clung to everything she touched. Then his voice, chuckling, arrogant, relaxed in the home that wasn't his. The doorknob turned, the hinge groaned, and there I was, standing in the dark, waiting. Dallas summers always carried the same weight, the kind of heat that glued shirts to your back and turned every car ride into a punishment. But inside our house, everything seemed staged for comfort. Neutral walls, curated furniture, a marriage polished enough to pass any inspection. People told us all the time that we looked like the couple who had it all figured out. I smiled and agreed. That's what wives do. On the surface, our life was as ordinary as anyone could want. He worked long hours in real estate, shaking hands, flipping properties, always bragging about the deals he closed. I managed a small boutique in Uptown, surrounded by fabrics and chatter, my own little kingdom where I controlled every detail. Weekends were for dinner parties, barbecues, evenings downtown where we played the role of the golden couple everyone else envied. Friends asked when we'd have children, and he always laughed it off with some line about timing, about still being young. At 34, I knew it wasn't about timing. It was about him, his need for freedom, his hunger for options. I told myself it didn't matter, that maybe someday he'd change his mind. Back then, I still let myself believe him. Our routines became rituals. Coffee at 6:30, his black, mine with cream. He kissed my cheek as he left, wallet tucked neatly in his jacket pocket, the same jacket that would later carry another woman's perfume. At night he returned with tired smiles, sometimes with wine, sometimes with excuses. I wanted to believe in the tiredness, not the excuses. I remember the first time I noticed. It was a Wednesday. I'd done laundry, folding his shirts the way he liked, when I found a receipt in his pocket. A restaurant. Not unusual. Except the bill was for 2 entrees, 2 glasses of wine, on a night he'd claimed to be working late at the office. I asked him about it, and he barely blinked. "Client dinner," he said, dismissive, as if the very question insulted him. I nodded, but something inside me shifted, like a door cracking open. Still, I buried it. That's what people in love do when they don't want their world to collapse. They explain away the details, smooth over the edges. My friends envied me. So how could I confess that I was starting to envy them? Their simple truths, their quiet trust. Looking back, I can see how carefully he had built his image. He was charming, the kind of man who always knew how to win a room. He told stories, exaggerated just enough to sound impressive, and people ate it up. At business dinners, I'd watch women hang on his words, their laughter pitched too high, their eyes too eager. I used to take pride in being the woman on his arm. Later, I realized I was just another part of his performance. There were nights I'd wake to the glow of his phone. He'd tilt it away, typing fast, saying it was work. My gut told me otherwise, but I rolled over, forcing myself back to sleep. To question it outright would have shattered the little world we had built, and I wasn't ready. Not yet. The boutiques I managed were my sanctuary. Among the racks of silk and linen, I could pretend everything at home was still fine. Customers complimented my taste. Co-workers admired my composure. Nobody saw the way my hands shook when I checked his social media, scanning for hints, for slips, for shadows of someone else. He was careful, but never careful enough. Dallas has a way of rewarding appearances. Our neighbors admired us, invited us to backyard cookouts, asked for his advice on property values. I'd sit beside him, smiling as he spoke, knowing that every word carried the weight of confidence built on lies. It wasn't one thing that broke the illusion. It was the accumulation, the late nights, the unexplained charges, the way he'd come home freshly showered, too clean for a man who'd just worked late at an office. The missing hours no one could account for. But the moment that seared itself into my memory was almost laughably small. We were at a friend's birthday dinner. He leaned in close to me, smiling at a joke, when I smelled it. Her perfume. That same cheap, powdery sweetness I'd later recognize everywhere. It clung to his collar, woven into the fibers. I froze mid-smile, my fork halfway to my lips, and forced myself to keep laughing as if nothing had happened. That was the first real fracture. The moment I knew something had slipped into our ordinary world, something that would never leave. The others at the table kept talking, oblivious, while I sat there with a smile carved into my face, staring at the man I thought I knew and realizing in silence that he was already gone. And deep down, I think he knew I felt it. I used to think betrayal was loud. I imagined shouting matches, slammed doors, the kind of chaos that makes the neighbors stare through their blinds. But the truth? It's quiet. It slips in through the cracks, hides in receipts, perfumes, and lies told with a straight face. It builds until silence becomes unbearable, until every ordinary sound feels like a warning bell. The night it all shattered, I wasn't even looking for it. He had said he was going out with colleagues, another property deal, another dinner where handshakes and drinks blurred into late hours. I pretended not to care, pretending that I was too busy with work at the boutique to notice. But something in my gut wouldn't let it go. I drove. Not to the office, not to the restaurants he usually named. I drove with no plan, just instinct pulling me. Dallas lights blurred past me, and I followed the thread of suspicion like a scent. By the time I parked 2 streets away from a modest beige house I'd never seen before, I already knew. The car out front was his. The porch light glowed faintly, and through the blinds, shadows moved. 2 figures, not one. My pulse should have spiked, but instead, I felt myself go still. Cold. The kind of stillness that feels like a decision already forming. I stepped out, quiet, shoes pressing into the grass instead of the pavement. The air smelled of cut hedges and cheap wine. Through the window I caught it, him relaxed on her couch, shirt unbuttoned, smiling in a way he hadn't smiled at me in months. And her, younger, blonde, legs tucked under her as if she owned him already. She touched his hand casually, like it belonged to her. The laugh that spilled from him gutted me, not because it was loud, but because it was tender. A softness I hadn't seen directed at me in years. I should have burst in, should have screamed. That's what they expect, isn't it? The scorned wife, hysterical, out of control. But I didn't move. I watched. I memorized. I let the betrayal etch itself into me like a scar, knowing scars don't fade. When she leaned in to kiss him, slow, deliberate, without hesitation, I turned away, not because I couldn't watch, but because I already understood. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a drunken lapse or a fleeting flirtation. This was planned. This was a second life, carefully maintained, stitched together by his arrogance and her willingness to be second. I walked back to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and gripped the wheel until my knuckles whitened. Rage didn't flood me the way I expected. Instead, it dripped, cold, measured, drop by drop, until all that was left was a clarity I'd never felt before. I could have confronted him that night. Waited until he came home, tossed his lies in his face, demanded answers he would never give honestly. But what good would that do? He'd twist it, gaslight me, make me question what I'd seen with my own eyes. That was his power, not just lying, but making others believe the lie was truth. So I stayed silent. I kissed him the next morning when he walked through the door smelling of her. I let him talk about the late night at the office, while I brewed his coffee, my smile steady. If he noticed how long I stared at him across the kitchen counter, he didn't comment. Men like him never expect the woman in front of them to be dangerous. Days passed, then weeks, and I collected more. Texts glimpsed when he left his phone unattended. Receipts tucked into his pockets. The sudden habit of carrying breath mints everywhere. Every detail was another nail in the coffin of the life we'd built, but I wasn't burying myself in it. I was building something else. The breaking point came when he brought her into my world. It was a Saturday, hot, the kind of day when the sun scorches the streets. We were invited to a barbecue at one of his colleagues' houses, a big event with wives, kids, the whole suburban circus. I dressed carefully, summer dress, subtle jewelry, the perfect wife. When we arrived, laughter filled the backyard, children running through sprinklers, steaks sizzling on the grill. And then I saw her. She was there, with him. Not in public as his mistress. No, she was introduced as a family friend, someone who helped with staging houses. Her hand brushed his arm too casually, her laugh lingered too long. And the worst part? Everyone smiled, nodded, welcomed her like she belonged. I stood there, a drink sweating in my hand, surrounded by people who thought they were watching harmless banter. But I knew. She knew. And he knew. That was when it hit me. He wasn't just betraying me privately. He was weaving her into the fabric of our lives, planting her like a parasite that would eventually replace me. That was when grief curdled into rage. We locked eyes once across the patio. Him, smirking faintly, daring me to make a scene. Me, silent, my smile never slipping. That was his miscalculation. He mistook silence for weakness. He had no idea silence is where plans are born. That night, when we came home, he collapsed on the couch, drunk and smug. "She's just a friend, Liz," he muttered, already half asleep. I stared at him, his head tilted back, his chest rising and falling, and I saw the man I married not as a partner, but as prey. The betrayal wasn't the kiss. It wasn't the lies. It was the arrogance. The belief that he could dismantle me piece by piece and I'd never sharpen the edges of what was left. I tucked him into bed like I always did, my hands steady. He didn't stir. He didn't see me watching him, memorizing every flaw, every weakness. And in that stillness, I knew. This wouldn't end with tears. It wouldn't end with me begging him to stay, or packing my bags in silence. It would end with me standing over the ruins of everything he thought was untouchable. The betrayal had happened. The wound was carved. Now it was my turn to carve back. The morning after that barbecue, I brewed his coffee the way I always did. Cream first, pour slow, stir twice. He sat at the counter scrolling his phone, yawning, pretending to be tired from work instead of from her. My hands didn't shake. My face didn't crack. I handed him the mug, kissed the top of his head, and in that moment, something inside me split for good. I wasn't his wife anymore. I was his executioner. It didn't happen with fireworks or tears. It happened with silence, the kind that settles so deep you can hear your own thoughts sharpen. Rage had burned away the fog. What was left was clean, surgical. I could see him for what he was, careless, arrogant, convinced I would always orbit his gravity. And I knew how to break men like that. You don't shout, you don't beg. You let them keep walking into the trap while you set the ground beneath them on fire. That day, I watched him leave for another meeting. He kissed me goodbye, keys jingling, his lies smooth as ever. I smiled and told him not to work too hard. When the door clicked shut, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the steam rising from my untouched coffee. My reflection shimmered faintly in the dark liquid. I didn't see a victim anymore. I saw someone dangerous. The decision wasn't whether to take revenge. It was how far I was willing to go. And as I sat there, every memory of his betrayal stacked neatly in my mind, I realized there was no line I wouldn't cross. I started small. Watching. Listening. Collecting. I didn't need confrontation. I needed proof, leverage, timing. He thought he was untouchable, that his charm and half-truths made him immune. But men like him never notice the woman who stops asking questions. They think silence is submission, when really it's the sound of someone taking aim. He underestimated me because I let him. That was his first mistake. One night, he left his phone on the nightstand while he showered. I didn't scroll. Scrolling was messy, panicked. I searched. Patterns, codes, threads. A contact saved under a man's name that wasn't a man at all. Texts buried in archived threads. Photos half hidden in deleted folders, still lingering in the cloud. He wasn't careful enough, not with me in the house. By the time he walked out of the bathroom, towel around his waist, I was smiling at a magazine, pretending not to notice his phone buzz in my lap. He never suspected. Why would he? To him, I was still Elizabeth, the loyal wife who folded shirts and smiled at barbecues. He didn't know I was already mapping his downfall in my head. I tested boundaries, slipped questions into conversations, watched his face when I mentioned colleagues, travel, expenses. He was smooth, I'll give him that, but smooth turns slippery when you know what to look for. He always blinked twice when he lied, always tilted his head just slightly when a story was fabricated. He thought he was fooling me. Every tell he revealed was another weapon in my pocket. The first real move I made was slipping into her world, not face to face, not yet, but through him, his emails on the shared laptop we used for taxes, his credit card statements, his casual mentions of addresses and times. I pieced her together like a puzzle until I could see her clearly, where she lived, where she worked, how she fit into his calendar of lies. And when I finally drove past her house on my own, watching the porch light glow against the siding, I knew this wasn't guesswork anymore. It was fact, tangible, real. That was the moment the decision crystallized. I wasn't going to confront him. I was going to dismantle him. I wanted him to feel what I felt, the creeping suspicion, the dread, the ground shifting beneath his feet. I wanted his arrogance to rot into paranoia, his certainty to dissolve into panic. And I wanted it all to happen slowly, so by the time he realized what was happening, there'd be nothing left to save. So I played my role. Sweet, steady, predictable Elizabeth, the woman who asked about his day, who laughed at his stories, who tucked him into the life he thought he owned. And every night, when he closed his eyes, I stayed awake, planning. Running through scenarios, testing outcomes in my head like rehearsals for a performance only I knew was coming. He thought the silence between us was distance. He didn't see it was calculation. One evening, I sat across from him at dinner. The clink of silverware the only sound. He was distracted, texting under the table. I studied him. The curve of his smile when her name lit up the screen. The ease with which he lied about work emergencies. He looked up at me, caught my eye, and smirked like he held all the cards. That was when I let myself think it. The thought I'd been circling, avoiding, denying. I will destroy you. Not out loud, not in some dramatic scene, just inside, quiet and steady. A vow made without witnesses. The kind of vow you don't break because breaking it would mean letting him win. I finished my wine, set down my fork, and smiled at him across the table. He mistook it for forgiveness, for love, for weakness. And I let him. Because the real power isn't in showing your hand. It's in letting the other player believe you're not even in the game. That night, when I slid into bed beside him, I whispered goodnight, pressed my lips to his cheek, and let him sleep soundly. He had no idea his wife was already planning his funeral. Not the one with flowers and eulogies, but the kind where a man's reputation, money, and dignity are buried so deep, he never finds them again. I learned quickly that vengeance is logistics more than emotion. Rage is the spark. Paperwork is the fire. If I wanted him gone, not just from my bed, but from the life he'd built, I had to make a plan that moved like a machine, predictable, implacable, and fueled by proof. So I sat down and wrote lists. Not the kind that tucks into drawers, but lists that change destinies. First list, what he had to lose. reputation, money, his standing in the neighborhood, clients who trusted his name, a marriage that made him look stable. Second list, what I needed to prove: texts, receipts, bookings, bank transfers, photos, witnesses. Third list, leverage points: a shaky business partner who owed him a favor, a legal technicality in a contract he'd signed, a clause in our joint accounts I could exploit. Each item turned into a task. Each task had a deadline. I hired a lawyer on a weekday and kept it casual when he asked. Just some paperwork, I said, voice even. The lawyer, a woman with a blunt bob and no patience for melodrama, did not smile. You don't want headlines, she told me over coffee. You want leverage, evidence, and a way to weaponize it. That sentence felt like permission. She was direct. We'll start with discovery on his business partners. Often affairs have financial footprints. New fact: his deals left fingerprints. I dug into the house first, not the one with beige siding, but ours. His desk, the safe behind the drywall, the files he assumed collected dust. I photocopied contracts, labeled them, scanned bank statements. I found an invoice he'd routed through an LLC with a different name. A shell payment to a staging company that only existed online. It was small, but the pattern mattered. He'd been funneling funds in ways he thought clever. That was one lever. I made a note. Connect the shell company to the mistress through a chain of deposits. Where did you learn to be so neat? My sister texted once, and I replied with a picture of my piles. Neat was a mask for obsession. I sorted his life into folders: work, personal, friends, the other. Every folder tightened like a noose. New escalation. I had a trail of money that could be followed. Next, I recruited an ally who didn't know he was an ally, his assistant, Claire. She was efficient, tired, and bored of cleaning up his after-work chaos. I pretended to be a worried friend, asking about deadlines and client names, and Claire, wanting to be helpful, started mentioning odd meetings and a staging consultant who popped up after open houses. Why would he bring someone like that to a client meeting? She asked once. Her question was a breadcrumb. I fed it into my case. I never once suggested she snoop. She offered details freely. New fact: his assistant would talk. I bought an old phone and a burner SIM. Not to spy. That's messy and illegal in ways that ruin plans. But to record conversations I had the right to record. With him, in our home, in public places where recording is legal. I arranged a meeting with one of his junior partners under the guise of networking. Over coffee, eyes steady, I asked about a recent property flip. He bragged, careless. He mentioned a consultant who handled staging costs directly. He even dropped a company name that matched the shell invoice I'd found. I sipped coffee and smiled. New fact: a partner's brag connected the money trail to a name. I planted small, believable seeds. At a weekend brunch where our neighbors drank mimosas, I mentioned casually that I'd heard about a property staging firm that was getting a lot of work lately. Really? Which one? My neighbor asked. I shrugged. Breadcrumbs. Better. I tipped a friendly real estate blogger, anonymously, with a hint about a luxury listing that had surprising staging expenses. She dug. Bloggers dig because they want traffic. Within a week, a small, innocuous post floated near the top of neighborhood search results about unusual staging costs tied to a local agent. The post was nothing by itself, but it drove eyes. New escalation. Public interest. Subtle, but real. There were close calls. Once I nearly got caught rifling for bank statements in his desk when he came home earlier than usual. I froze, a hand on a file I hadn't yet sealed. He opened the study, glanced around, and said, "You're home early." I smiled, placed the paper back, and sat at the kitchen table, acting absorbed in a magazine. He never suspected because arrogance blinds. He left again that night, and I exhaled so slowly I almost laughed. Near capture taught me the importance of alibis. I made legal moves he couldn't see. With the lawyer's help, I quietly checked records. Any pending liens, prior complaints, odd incorporations. I filed for a discreet financial review of joint accounts under the pretense of tax organizing. The bank sent my secure copies. I scanned them at home and found a transfer that matched a wire to an account in her name. It was small enough not to raise alarms, big enough to prove intent. New fact, money trail reached her account. At the boutique, I hired a temp who just happened to be a freelance photographer. The temp asked to take inventory photos for our online store. While she shot, she chatted. She mentioned her roommate's friend who did interior styling on the side. Her roommate forwarded a message, a text thread with photos, and in one of them, a familiar cufflink lay on a dresser beside an open bottle of that same perfume. It was a dumb, human mistake. A cufflink with his initials. I saved the image. New escalation. A photograph tied him to her bedroom. I planted a legal scare for him without touching his accounts. I fed a subtle rumor into the right channels. That a disgruntled former client had been promised payment and never received it. I didn't allege fraud. I only suggested paperwork discrepancies. The rumor reached one of his larger clients who called to confirm. He stammered. People who run businesses hate doubt. That client pulled a small project. He didn't realize losing one account would fray the rest. That was the point. Erosion by detail. Week by week, the web tightened. I set up a fake consultation with a private investigator, a clean one who would later testify to the steps I had taken. He cataloged everything with clinical calm. "You're building a case, not vengeance," he said. "Keep records, keep receipts, keep your distance." His voice was a metronome. New fact, I documented the documentation. The final piece was timing. I wanted a moment public enough to humiliate, but private enough to control. I chose a charity gala where his firm would present. He loved those appearances. Tailored suit, easy smile, applause. I arranged for a staged leak the week before. A blogger's whisper, a tip into a real estate forum, a forwarded tax note to an editor who owed me a favor. I built pressure so that on the night of the gala, the room's attention would already be susceptible. And then I tested the plan in miniature. I confronted the mistress's pattern online, sent an anonymous note to her staging company asking about work dates, and watched as she flailed, told a friend, and then lied to him about invoices. His slackness showed. He answered with a single word. Okay, that slackness was arrogance under pressure, the best kind of mistake. The moment I folded everything, the invoices, the photos, the recorded conversations, the partner's offhand admission, the bank transfers, into one file, I felt something shift. This wasn't a pile of paper. It was a machine. It would move when I turned the key. I labeled the file. Ready. I sat at my kitchen table at midnight, the house quiet, and read through it all. Each page tightened my resolve. Each entry promised ruin. He had never considered that I could be patient, that I could be methodical. He had never imagined his wife would prefer an architected fall to a theatrical fight. Outside, an ambulance siren faded down our street. Inside, I closed the file and exhaled once, cleanly. The plan was set. The execution was next. The gala felt like a stage built for him. Crystal chandeliers, muted music, the kind of crowd that applauds a smile and assumes everything behind it is clean. He loved nights like this. The applause, the easy jokes, the way people leaned in for his stories. He arrived in his usual orbit, shaking hands, folding charm around him like armor. He had no idea the armor was made of paper. I arrived later than him, as planned, in a quiet dress that made no claim for attention. I greeted neighbors, exchanged practiced pleasantries, and let my hand brush his for a moment that looked like tenderness. He smiled at me the way men smile when they believe their routine is still in motion. "You look beautiful," he said, and the room brightened for him. He did not know those words were the last ordinary ones he would say in public. The night unfolded exactly the way I calculated. My lawyer sat near the podium. The private investigator hovered by the wine table. Claire, his assistant, had texted me once earlier to confirm she'd be at the event. She'd been instructed to sit where she could see his face. The blogger I'd fed the rumor to circulated a quiet thread hours before the gala, nudging curiosity. Little cracks showed up like insects in the perfect lacquer. Someone in the crowd whispered a name. Heads turned slightly. A conversation stalled. That was the pressure I engineered. He took the stage to a polite ovation. He told a rehearsed anecdote about a new development, his voice easy, practiced. People laughed. I watched his mouth move and felt no mercy. My lawyer rose then, as if on cue, and asked for the microphone, not to shame, but to present facts. My stomach was steady. The audience shifted, attentive. He glanced at me once, slight confusion in his smile. That was when I flicked the switch. The screen behind the podium lit up with an innocuous slide. Financial discrepancies. Summary. Quiet clicks filled the room as people leaned forward. My lawyer spoke calmly, clinical, letting each sentence land. Over the past 18 months, transfers from company accounts have been routed through an entity labeled Lux Staging LLC, she said. Those transfers correlate with personal expenditures and deposits to third-party accounts tied to an individual named, she paused, Ms. Hannah Price. The room inhaled. He moved, a flicker of color draining from his face. That's incorrect, he said, voice sharp enough to cut the silence. He'd always used quick denials to paper over holes. Tonight they would not stick. My private investigator rose and walked to the stage. He clicked through a timeline, invoices, timestamps, receipts. Each slide was a new fact, a transfer here, a deposit there, a photo of his cufflink on her dresser. The evidence unfolded like a map that led straight to him. People who had trusted him saw patterns where he'd hoped there were only coincidences. One slide showed a recorded conversation I had the right to record. His voice, casual, arranging payment for staging costs, and suggesting the funds be routed through a specific account. It was not a confession, but it was intent. The room's hum turned to a low murmur. He tried to speak. "This is," he started. His voice failed in the face of paper and pixels. I heard a woman near the back whisper, "Is that his signature?" And then another, "They're freezing accounts." My lawyer produced a court order, emergency freeze on specific accounts, and a notice of pending litigation. A representative from the bank appeared, pale and matter-of-fact, and announced they had received a sanctioned request to restrict access pending review. His eyes widened. For the first time, he looked small. New escalation. His liquidity was cut off. He stumbled through explanations that smelled of rehearsed charm. "There's a misunderstanding," he insisted, voice high. "This is personal, not professional." The junior partner I'd cultivated rose then, voice steady, and contradicted him on record. "We approved transfers for staging work," the partner said. "We didn't know it was personal." The partner's admission was a blade. Clients who had been passive before now had reason to worry. One of them stood, looking betrayed, and left. Others followed. New fact. His client base began to peel away. She, Hannah, stood then, pale and trembling, because I'd ensured a way for her to be present without knowing the whole script. When she saw the bank notice and the photos, she broke. Her voice cracked as she tried to deny knowledge, then admitted a payment had been made into her account. That admission fractured his lies in front of everyone. He reached for her hand and she stepped back as if burned. Public betrayal became public humiliation in an instant. Security moved in slow, polite circles. He yelled something I couldn't catch. His assistant, Claire, looked at him with a betrayal I had cultivated patiently. She had already sent a brief to the board with the documents I'd supplied. They had drafted a statement, immediate suspension pending investigation. It was crisp, fast. New escalation, his firm severed ties within the hour. My tactic had never been to destroy his life in one spectacle. It was to remove the scaffolding. Tonight, I removed it in a way that ensured the collapse would be irreversible. Contracts were rescinded, loans were frozen. The firm's reputation, once its capital, unraveled in minutes. Reporters who'd been tipped earlier sniffed the story and hovered at the doors. Within an hour, the gala's elegance turned into chaos. Whispers turned to cameras. He tried to storm out, throat raw. Someone blocked his path. "You need to wait," a board member said, voice quiet but final. "We'll address this legally." He demanded his phone. The bank representative shook his head. The emergency freeze spared no access. He lunged for the microphone, shouting denials and accusations, but the audience had already been handed a different narrative, one framed by documents, recordings, and witnesses. Denial sounded desperate in a room that had seen the receipts. The mistress left with her head down, escorted by an acquaintance. He followed, eyes wild, trying to grab for control of something he'd assumed was his. Outside, cameras captured him pleading with her, his voice small. On social media, the first murmurs of the story spread like an oil slick. Clients called their lawyers. The firm released a terse statement. "We are cooperating with inquiries and have suspended the partner pending review." The suspension read like a final sentence. New fact: his professional identity was legally severed. He had expected to sleep well that night, to wake with the same arrogance. Instead, he woke to calls he could not answer, to messages from people who had been assets now turned adversaries. His accounts were locked. His partners refused to return his calls. One by one, the structures he leaned on were removed. Within days, an auditor presented evidence of discrepancies substantial enough to trigger regulatory review. The pressure moved from rumor to legal peril. The final blow was quieter than the rest. With everything in motion, I filed for an emergency injunction and a civil suit that would tie up his assets for months. I made sure the filing included the transfers, the recorded conversations, the partner's sworn statement, and the photograph of his cufflink. When the papers served him, he read them in the glossy light of our kitchen and could not summon charm to change the words. I watched him read the amount listed, the accusation of misappropriation, the notice of immediate asset seizure. He looked up at me, defeated, not because he had lost love, but because he had lost leverage. His last face, the one that remains in my mind, was not of a man crying. It was the face of someone who realized his world had been legally excised. "You'll regret this," he muttered, not with threat, but with stunned disbelief. He had no idea how right he was. He would regret it forever, in ways that would strip him of everything he once used to define himself. I didn't celebrate. I let the silence do the rest. The machine I built hummed. Clients pulled funds, the firm dissolved partnerships, the mistress's name tumbled through feeds. He tried to buy time, to charm his way back, but the record spoke louder than his smile. In the end, it wasn't a single spectacular moment that finished him. It was the legal clamps, the walking away of people who once relied on him, the slow erosion of every advantage he'd hoarded. The final blow, the injunction, the sealed assets, the termination letter, left him without recourse. No apology would rebuild those bridges. No explanation would bring back the clients. He called me once after the filings, voice thin. "Why?" he asked. I paused, tasting the last of a satisfaction I had kept carefully contained. "Because you made me invisible," I answered simply. And I wasn't going to stay invisible. He didn't argue. He knew the truth of that, even if he would never say it out loud. His downfall was complete in ways he could not reverse. The room where he had once commanded attention now held his absence like a verdict. When the dust settled, he was unrecognizable. The man who once walked into rooms expecting applause now shuffled through them like a ghost. His accounts frozen, contracts voided, clients gone, his entire life reduced to paperwork stamped terminated. Even the mistress disappeared, her social pages scrubbed clean, her silence louder than any confession. I expected the rush of victory, but what I felt was cleaner, calmer. Like finishing precise work with no mistakes. Dallas kept moving, barbecues, boutiques, small talk in grocery stores. Life slid back to ordinary for me while his name turned into the city's favorite rumor. People whispered, neighbors glanced, and he learned the humiliation of being a headline no one defended. He begged for negotiation. "Let's handle this quietly," he said one night, voice trembling, eyes darting like a man trapped. I let him finish his plea, then answered with the same word my lawyer filed the next morning. Denied. He still believed remorse could buy him back his dignity. He hadn't learned that what's lost this way never returns. The hearing came quickly. He wore a suit that fit like disguise, skin pale under courtroom light. My evidence was clean. Transfers, contracts, the photo of his cufflink beside her perfume. The judge didn't need theatrics. His suspension was entered into record, assets seized, his reputation excised in language colder than I could ever deliver. The twist I saved for last wasn't personal. It was public. When the court ordered restitution of misapplied funds, I directed it not into my account, but into a foundation I'd set up months earlier. Second Chances for Women. The documents made it official. His money, funneled through lies, used to finance betrayal, now rebuilt lives of women who'd been left with nothing. The news spread, picked up by the same feeds that once promoted his deals. His disgrace carried a headline he could never outrun. Disgraced realtors' funds redirected to Women's Foundation. That broke him more than losing me, more than losing her. He had imagined I would take his car, his house, his pride. Instead, I turned his arrogance into a weapon he couldn't reclaim. The money he thought would buy him secrecy became public restitution. Every time the charity's name appeared, it carried his failure beneath it. Even his family fractured. His mother, once his most loyal defender, stood at a church luncheon and called his actions a stain we will not excuse. His sister blocked him. The mistress, in her last message, left him with 4 words. "You should have left." I sold the boutique, moved across town, and carried one photograph with me. A still frame from the gala, his hand outstretched in desperation, face twisted when the room turned away. Not triumph, but a map. A reminder of what arrogance becomes when it finally collapses. On the morning I left, he texted me one last time. "You'll regret this." I smiled, closed my suitcase, and left it unanswered. Because regret belongs to him now. Only him.